The upscale terminal of Toronto Pearson International Airport's Terminal 1 fell into a strange, suffocating quiet on a Tuesday afternoon in late November, the kind of quiet that doesn't belong in a place built entirely around motion and noise, when a gate agent named Derek Holloway pointed his finger directly into the chest of a woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong and told her, in front of 43 waiting passengers, to step out of the boarding line. The woman he chose to humiliate was Major Adaeze Okonkwo-Barnes of the Canadian Armed Forces, 41 years old, decorated veteran of 2 overseas deployments, holder of the Meritorious Service Medal, and one of the most quietly formidable human beings ever to pass through the departures level of that airport. She was not in uniform. She was wearing a camel-coloured wool coat, dark trousers, and carrying a single leather carry-on that her late mother had given her the Christmas before her first deployment to Afghanistan. She looked, to the casual observer, like exactly what she was, a composed, elegant woman of means travelling business class on a Tuesday afternoon. To Derek Holloway, she looked like a problem. Holloway was a 12-year veteran of the airline's ground operations, a man whose personnel file had accumulated 6 formal complaints in the past 4 years, for aggressive conduct, for making passengers feel targeted, for what one supervisor had written, then carefully softened in the final report, as a demonstrated pattern of selective enforcement. He had survived each complaint the same way, through a combination of union protection, sympathetic shift supervisors, and the institutional reluctance of a large corporation to admit that one of its public-facing employees had been behaving like a petty tyrant in a blue vest and a clip-on lanyard. He had been managing the gate for Air Canada Flight 881, non-stop to Vancouver for 90 minutes when Major Okonkwo-Barnes joined the business class boarding queue. The flight was overbooked in economy. A handful of passengers had been upgraded. The boarding process had been straightforward until Holloway looked up from his screen, saw her near the front of the line, and made a decision in the space of half a second that would define the rest of his professional life. He stepped around the podium. He did not call her name. He did not lower his voice. He walked directly to her, positioned himself between her and the jet bridge door, and said, loudly enough for the rows of waiting passengers to hear without effort, "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me and verify your ticket at the desk before you board." Adaeze Okonkwo-Barnes had been in situations where a wrong reaction cost lives. She had led a 12-person unit through a collapsed building in Kandahar in 2011. She had delivered a field medical assessment under active fire and kept 3 soldiers alive until the medevac arrived. She was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a woman who panicked. She looked at Derek Holloway with a calm so absolute it registered as its own kind of pressure. "My ticket was verified at check-in," she said, "and again at the security desk." "There may be a discrepancy with your upgrade," Holloway said, not quite meeting her eyes. "We need to resolve it before you board." "What kind of discrepancy?" "A seating discrepancy." He gestured toward the podium with the brisk authority of a man who expected compliance on the strength of the gesture alone. "If you'll just step over." She did not move immediately. She took a measured breath. The couple directly behind her in the queue, an older white man in a fleece vest and his wife, watched the exchange with the politely horrified attention of people who suspected they were witnessing something wrong, but hadn't yet decided whether to say so. "I would like to understand the specific nature of the discrepancy," Adaeze said, her voice carrying the flat precision of someone accustomed to requiring clarity in high-pressure environments, "before I step out of the line." Holloway's jaw tightened. In his experience, which was, as he understood it, extensive, a polite but firm redirect was usually enough. People backed down, they apologized, they shuffled to the side, especially when he used his full posture and his gate agent voice and the implicit authority of the uniform, which technically was not a uniform at all, but a corporate branded vest, though Holloway had never fully absorbed that distinction. "Ma'am, I'm not going to debate this with you at the gate. If there's a problem with your ticket, the sooner we address it at the desk, the sooner you'll be on the plane. Or not." He added the last 2 words almost casually, but their weight was unmistakable. The woman behind Adaeze in line made a small sound. The older gentleman in the fleece vest shifted his carry-on from one hand to the other and stared at the side of Holloway's face with a particular kind of attention. Adaeze reached into the interior pocket of her coat and produced her boarding pass. She held it out flat face up, the way she had once held maps in briefing rooms. "Business class, seat 4A, booked 6 weeks ago under my legal name. No upgrade, I purchased the fare directly." Holloway glanced at it. One glance. He didn't pick it up, didn't scan it, didn't compare it to whatever was on his screen. "I still need you to step to the desk." The older gentleman in the fleece vest spoke up then, quietly, almost apologetically. "Excuse me, I've been watching this and her boarding pass looks completely valid to me. Is there actually a problem?" Holloway turned to him with the particular condescension reserved for bystanders who insert themselves where they haven't been invited. "Sir, this is a matter between the airline and this passenger. I'd ask you to please stay in your place in the queue." "I'm just saying," the man said, not backing down, "that she showed you her boarding pass and you didn't look at it." "Sir." Holloway's voice had acquired the specific edge of a man who had decided this had gone on long enough. He turned back to Adaeze. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to step to the side. If you refuse, I have the authority to deny you boarding and have your baggage removed from the aircraft." The gate area was entirely silent now. A toddler in a stroller 3 rows back made a sound and was immediately shushed. Adaeze Okonkwo-Barnes did not raise her voice. She did not reach for her phone. She stood completely still for a moment in the manner of someone running rapid and precise calculations, then said, "I'd like to know your full name and employee number, please." "You'll get that information from customer service." "I'm asking for it now." "Derek Holloway," he said, because refusing to give his name would have been its own escalation. "And I'm the senior gate agent for this flight, which means—" "Mr. Holloway." Her voice did not warm. "I am asking you for the last time to explain the specific and factual discrepancy with my ticket. Not a general discrepancy, a specific one. Because if you cannot do that, what you're doing right now has a name, and that name is not standard protocol." 3 phones had appeared in the boarding area, held at chest height with the careful casualness of people trying not to look like they were recording. Holloway's face did something complicated. Beneath the practiced authority, something had shifted. The faint recognition that the calculation he had made 30 seconds ago might have been wrong. But the thing about a certain kind of ego is that it experiences doubt not as a correction but as a threat. And threats require escalation rather than retreat. He reached for his radio. "I'm calling for airport security," he said. "We have a non-compliant passenger at gate C-17. He expected that to end it. It usually ended it. What happened instead was that the gate door, the one leading from the jet bridge back into the terminal, the door that was supposed to remain closed during boarding, opened. The man who stepped through it was tall, wide in the shoulders, and wearing the uniform of a Royal Canadian Air Force Air Commodore, 2 gold braid loops on his sleeve, a chest bearing the ribbon of the Meritorious Service Cross and several others that required specific and distinguished service to earn. He had silver at his temples and the measured, unhurried movement of a man who had spent the better part of 3 decades being the most important person in whatever room he walked into. Air Commodore Raymond Okonkwo-Barnes was Adaeze's father-in-law. He had been in the forward cabin conducting what the airline's operations director had described in a brief and slightly nervous phone call to his supervisor 40 minutes earlier as a routine command liaison walkthrough, a quarterly check on airline partnerships with military travel coordination that the Air Force had been conducting for going on 8 years. He had stepped back onto the jet bridge briefly to take a call from Ottawa. He had heard everything. He came through that door and he stood behind Derek Holloway and he did not say a word. He simply waited. Holloway became aware of him the way a person becomes aware of a change in air pressure. Not all at once but in accumulating increments. The shift in the posture of the passengers, the redirected eyes, the complete and total absence of sound in the boarding area. He turned around. He took in the uniform in the way that civilians who have never served still understand uniforms, that the more elaborate they are, the more distance there is between the person wearing them and the person looking at them. He saw the braid. He saw the ribbons. He saw the expression, which was not anger exactly, but was the complete absence of anything that might be mistaken for patience. "I'm sorry," Holloway said reflexively, before he'd consciously decided to speak. I wasn't aware." "Aware of what exactly?" Air Commodore Okonkwo-Barnes said. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It was the voice of a man who had given addresses to hangars full of armed personnel and had never needed a microphone. "What specifically were you unaware of when you pulled my daughter-in-law out of the boarding queue and threatened to have her removed from her flight?" Holloway's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out. "She showed you a valid boarding pass." The Air Commodore continued, stepping closer. He was not an aggressive presence. He was a completely calm one, in the manner of a structure that is entirely immovable. "You chose not to examine it." She provided her name. "She requested the specific nature of your complaint. You could not produce one, so I'd like you to produce one now, in front of these people." He gestured. almost conversationally at the boarding area. Take your time. I was flagged for a potential. Holloway stopped. He started again. The system flagged a possible seating. Show me the screen, the Air Commodore said. I'm sorry? Your screen at the podium. Show me the flag. Holloway walked to the podium. His hands moved over the keyboard with the visible discomfort of a man who already knows what he won't find. The Air Commodore followed at a distance of 2 steps and looked at the screen over his shoulder. The older man in the fleece vest had, by this point, moved close enough to see clearly and made no pretense of looking elsewhere. The screen showed Flight 881. It showed Seat 4A. Its name Okonkwo-Barnes, A in clean block letters, listed as a confirmed full-fare business class booking with no flags, no holds, no discrepancies of any kind. There was a very long silence. Mr. Holloway, the Air Commodore said, his voice dropping a register, I am going to ask you to do 2 things. First, you are going to step away from this gate. Second, you are going to call your supervisory chain right now, before a single additional person boards this aircraft, because I intend to have a conversation with your operations director and your regional VP, and I would prefer they hear about this from you first, as a professional courtesy. That is the entirety of the professional courtesy you are going to receive from me this afternoon. Holloway's radio crackled. He'd called for security 4 minutes ago and forgotten about it. 2 airport security officers arrived at C-17 to find a situation that was, from their perspective, somewhat confusing. A gate agent standing pale and silent at a podium, a decorated Air Force senior officer standing 3 feet behind him, and a boarding area full of passengers who had unanimously and wordlessly elected not to board until whatever this was had resolved itself. The older man in the fleece vest identified himself to the security officers as a retired Ontario court judge named Gerald Whitmore, and mentioned in the helpful and precise manner of someone who had spent a career evaluating the credibility of accounts that he had observed the entire exchange from a distance of roughly 1 meter, and would be pleased to provide a written statement to whomever required one. His wife added that she had been recording since the moment Holloway reached for his radio. Adaeze Okonkwo-Barnes walked to her seat in 4A without further incident. She placed her mother's leather bag in the overhead compartment, sat down, and accepted a glass of sparkling water from a flight attendant who was doing her visible best to project professional composure. The cabin crew had heard everything through the jet bridge door. The operations director for Air Canada's Terminal 1 arrived at gate C-17 11 minutes after the Air Commodore made the call. His name was Patrick Shrivastava, and he had the brisk, efficient manner of a man who managed crises for a living, and therefore recognized them at a distance. What he found at C-17 was unambiguous. The boarding pass record was clear. The system log showed no flag of any kind on Okonkwo-Barnes' ticket. There was no technical justification for the removal from the queue. There was no procedural explanation. There was only Derek Holloway, who by this point had exhausted his supply of alternative narratives and sat in a gate chair with his lanyard twisted in his fingers, not quite able to look at anyone directly. Shrivastava spoke with the Air Commodore in the terminal corridor for 17 minutes. He reviewed his wife's recording, with their permission, on her phone. He spoke with Gerald Whitmore, whose account was delivered with the measured economy of a man who had learned to give testimony without ornamentation. The flight to Vancouver departed 38 minutes late. It would be the last flight Derek Holloway managed for Air Canada. By the following morning, the airline's HR and Equity Division had opened a formal investigation. By the end of that week, they had accessed Holloway's full complaint history, which bore a distinct and uncomfortable pattern that internal supervisors had elected. Across 6 separate instances, not to act upon, the investigation expanded. 2 additional former passengers had come forward with accounts consistent with what Gerald Whitmore described. A third contacted the airline through a human rights advocacy organization in Toronto. Holloway was terminated 6 weeks after the incident at C-17. His union filed a grievance. The grievance was reviewed and declined. The pattern of conduct was too well documented, the witnesses too credible, the gap between the written record and what had actually been happening at gates across Terminal 1 too wide to be explained away. The union representative handling his case was later quoted, in an internal memo obtained during the subsequent legal proceedings, as saying that this was not a situation we can defend. The subsequent human rights complaint, filed by Major Okonkwo-Barnes through the Canadian Human Rights Commission, was settled 14 months after the incident. The terms were not disclosed. What was disclosed, because the airline chose to issue a public statement, was an unequivocal apology, not the hedged, both sides kind that corporations produce when they are trying to minimize damage, but the specific kind, with names and dates and an acknowledgement that the incident represented a failure the airline took full and direct responsibility for. The statement also announced a review of customer interaction protocols across all Canadian terminals, and the implementation of a third-party equity audit of hiring and discipline practices in ground operations. The Air Commodore did not issue any statement, neither did Major Okonkwo-Barnes. She arrived in Vancouver on the evening of that Tuesday in late November, was met at the baggage carousel by her husband, Captain Marcus Barnes, Royal Canadian Army, home from Petawawa for the week, and they went for dinner at a restaurant near the waterfront that her mother-in-law had recommended. She had the salmon. She did not mention the incident at the airport until Marcus asked directly why her flight had been late, and then she told him the whole thing in the direct, sequential manner of someone filing an after-action report. Marcus listened without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did Dad enjoy himself?" Adaeze picked up her wine glass. He was very calm about it. "He's always calm," Marcus said. "I know," she said. "That's the part that scared Holloway." What Derek Holloway had done that afternoon at Gate C-17 was not unusual. That was perhaps the most important thing about it. It was ordinary. It was the mundane, habitual exercise of a particular kind of power by a man who had exercised it many times before, and had been protected many times before, and had every reason to believe that Tuesday afternoon would be no different from any other. He did not make a mistake in the way that a person fumbles a coffee or misreads a gate number. He made a choice, grounded in an assumption he had tested and had reinforced many times, which was that certain people would not push back, and that if they did, his authority would absorb the friction. He was right about almost everything except the part that mattered, the part where he thought he understood the room. The Air Commodore never filed a personal complaint. He did not attend the tribunal. He flew back to Ottawa the following morning on a different Air Canada flight, arrived on time, and spent the day in a series of meetings about procurement that had nothing to do with Derek Holloway or Terminal 1, or the particular expression on a gate agent's face when he realizes he has just made the worst professional decision of his 12-year career. The Air Commodore was not interested in dramatic endings. He was interested in institutional accountability, which is a slower and less satisfying thing, but which, in his experience, was the only kind that lasted. Justice in the real world rarely arrives with music. It arrives in the form of a HR file being opened, a union grievance being declined, a public statement being issued with specific language that took 3 lawyers and a communications director 2 weeks to agree on. It arrives in the form of the other 6 complaints, the ones filed by people who did not have a retired judge standing behind them, or a camera, or an Air Force officer walking through the jet bridge door, finally being read by someone who had the authority and the will to act on them. It arrives, in other words, not just for the person who was targeted on Tuesday, but for everyone who was targeted before Tuesday and couldn't prove it. Derek Holloway moved back to his hometown of Barrie, Ontario after the termination. He applied for work in 2 other airport roles and was not hired. He did not return to aviation. Major Adaeze Okonkwo-Barnes was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel 14 months later. The ceremony was held at CF Train on a clear October morning. Her father-in-law attended in full uniform and stood in the front row. She didn't mention the airport in her remarks. She didn't need to. The people who were there knew who she was, and the people who had watched from Gate C-70 on a Tuesday afternoon in November knew it too, even if they'd never see her again. That there are people in this world who carry their authority so deep inside them that no one standing between them and a jet bridge door can touch it, and the ones who try tend to discover that fact in the most permanent way possible. If this story of quiet dignity, institutional accountability, and a long overdue reckoning moved you, take a second to hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Voices of Courage, because the stories that matter most are often the ones that happen in the most ordinary places, to people who were simply trying to get where they were going. I keep thinking about the moment Derek Holloway looked at that boarding pass and didn't actually read it. One glance. Then he handed it back and kept going, because he'd already decided. The decision had been made the second he saw her standing in that queue, composed, unhurried, belonging there in every way that mattered, and chose to see something else entirely. That's not a mistake. Mistakes happen when you're trying and fall short. What Holloway did was something different. It was the quiet, practiced confidence of someone who had done this before and had never once been asked to account for it. 6 complaints. 6 times the system absorbed the impact so he didn't have to. And so he kept going, kept choosing, kept assuming that the people he targeted would absorb it too. What I think about most is Adaeze in that moment, Not the Air Commodore stepping through the door, not Gerald Whitmore reaching for his phone, but Adaeze herself, standing at gate C-17 and deciding not to move. She didn't need someone to rescue her. She had already done everything right. She had her boarding pass, her name on the screen, her alibi written into the airline's own system. She stood there and she asked for a specific answer to a specific question, calmly, twice, because she understood that clarity is its own form of courage. That's the thing I come back to. She was never confused about what was happening to her. She just refused to let confusion be mistaken for weakness. There's a kind of integrity that doesn't announce itself. Adaeze had spent 2 decades building it, not to impress anyone, not to have it validated at a boarding gate in November, but because that's the kind of person she chose to become. When Holloway pushed, there was nothing soft to push against. Not defiance, not fear, just a woman who knew exactly who she was and wasn't willing to pretend otherwise for someone else's comfort. And then there's Raymond. The Air Commodore didn't raise his voice. He asked for the screen. He said, "Show me the flag." Because the most powerful thing you can say to someone who is lying about procedure is, "Let's look at the procedure together." He didn't need to threaten. He didn't need to perform. He had spent 40 years in rooms where authority was earned through exactly this, the ability to stay absolutely still while the truth did the work. What happened to Holloway afterward wasn't dramatic. It was administrative. Files, hearings, a union grievance declined in 2 paragraphs. But those files meant that the 6 people who came before Adaeze, the ones who couldn't prove anything, who didn't have a retired judge standing a meter away, who walked off that day carrying something they couldn't put down, their accounts finally counted for something. That's the part that moved me when I thought it all the way through. Justice in that form is slow and unglamorous, and it matters enormously. I think we teach ourselves to wait for the big moment, the dramatic reversal, the confrontation that ends everything cleanly. But most of the time what actually changes things is someone refusing to be moved, someone asking the right question twice, and someone else quietly deciding to pull out a personnel file on a Wednesday morning. Moral backbone, clear thinking, and the endurance to let the process work. That's what it actually looks like when accountability shows up. Not a speech, just a screen at a podium and a name that was there all along.